Hello students and welcome to this video 2.6 communication, and this is video 1 of 1, and this is the 6th topic in human resource management. And if you're an SL student, this is the last topic because you don't do 2.7 because that's HL. So there's only one video in this chapter because it's a really short chapter. There's only 2 learning objectives, and I think a lot of it you might know already. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So the title of the chapter is communication. Let's define communication. I think we have an idea of what communication is, but communication is when information moves from one person to another. There's lots of different definitions out there, but that's the one I like to use. It's when somebody has information or a group of people have information and they move that information to someone else. So what are some examples of the communication? Well, a lot of communication obviously happens verbally. So we talk to people via phone or in person, etc. But also, you've heard this term non-verbal communication. So this is body language. So like if I sit with my arm, you've heard the thing about if I sit my arms like that, people say it indicates something. Well, I don't always agree with that. Maybe somebody's cold. Maybe if somebody doesn't look you in the eye. So if I'm doing this video looking away, then maybe that indicates, I think you get the idea, but body language, they say, communicates a lot of information. We can obviously communicate written and images as well. So through diagrams, images, pictures, we can then communicate with people that way. So then we've got the learning objective is formal and informal methods of communication. So let's define those. So formal communication is basically it's official, part of the business. It's going to be structured and it's directly about the business. I don't know why I put business person there. I'm very bad with typos, you might have noticed. About the business, that word business person shouldn't be there. So this is basically how a lot of communication is done within the business. So things like emails to people, those are obviously going to be official. Meetings are going to be official as well. Video conferencing, so in the past this was less common, but because of COVID and home officing, video conferencing through Zoom and Google Meets, that's obviously become a lot more commonplace. Writing reports, presentations, memos, etc., etc. It's basically any way that people within the business communicate about the purpose of the business overall. And there are pros and cons with these, which we're going to look at in a minute. And then informal communication, I did correct this typo, which is good, is again communication, but here it's unofficial means. So it's going to be unofficial. It's not generally structured, and it might not always be about the business. It might be about other things. And the classic one people talk about is this water cooler chat. I've always called this like a coffee machine chat. Basically, the idea with the water cooler or the coffee machine is that when you go and get your coffee or your water, you bump into other people in the business, and then you end up having some sort of communication, which may be about the business or maybe about other things, but it's basically informal communication. What about instant messaging or use of WhatsApp and things like that? That's generally going to be more informal, although I have worked in businesses where use of WhatsApp or equivalents is actually formal and you'll be contacted that way. So I think messages can be formal or informal. Team events might be, days off where you go and do training activities or maybe activities after work where it tends to be a lot less structured, etc., etc. And there's lots of other examples as well. So this is an AO3. AO3 means evaluation. So in theory, you want to know about the pros and cons of these different methods of communication. And there are so many of them, and I think a lot of them are kind of common sense. But I am going to do just very briefly looking at the pros of an email versus the pros of a meeting. And I have this myself sometimes. I've got a question I want to ask something or somebody, or I've got an issue and I'm like, I'll just write an email being like, oh no, I'll go and see them. And just by doing these slides, I'm like, what are the pros and cons of doing that? Well, the pros of email are clearly geographical. For me, that's less relevant because I can just walk up to a different part of the building. But, if that person's in a different city, then obviously email or phone's going to be a lot easier. Could be more time effective. Not always, but often if you write an email, you can just quickly write an email and get it done. If you're actually talking to that person, then it's more likely to be they're going to ask you questions, clarifications, maybe there's small talk involved. And so if I'm in a rush, I'll tend to do an email because then you don't have to do those things. It also provides a paper trail, so it can be read later. So the benefits of that is that if you are receiving the email, then you can read it, and then you can read it again later. You can check everything. You can make sure you've done everything in the email. And also, if somebody doesn't do things that you've communicated in an email, you can go back to it later and say, well, I sent you this and you didn't do it. And so that's one benefit within a business. It's kind of like making sure that you've done what you should do, and then it's on someone else. Pros of meeting in person, less likely to misinterpret what's communicated. So I don't know if you've had this thing where you get an email, somebody writes something and you're like, oh, crikey, they wrote that. And then when you speak to them in person, they're like, oh, I didn't mean that, I meant this. And so nowadays, when I get emails like that, I always go and ask, what did you mean? What did you mean by that? And so, but if you have that meeting in person, then you can ask those questions about what the meaning of things are. Provides video, audio, and visual information as well. So things like body language. I think that when people say things, if you can see their body language, even if it's subconscious, you can actually benefit from that. And I think it's easier to build trust. When you're in person, you're more likely to build up some sort of trust going on rather than having that email communication. Okay, on to the last learning objective, which is barriers to communication. And this is things that stop or limit the effectiveness of the transfer of information. This is a very, very formal way of saying people don't get the information they're being told. I think it's another way of saying it. I think one of the main ones within a business is language and culture. So obviously language is probably the number one barrier to communicate. Probably the number one barrier to communicate. Then maybe there's another one. But culture as well. So in some cultures, if somebody has a problem, they'll say it directly and say, my problem is X, Y, Z. Some cultures, they might not say that. They might skirt around the issue more. And that can be confusing because people might expect people to say things directly, but then it doesn't happen. And then they get confused because no one said it. Too much use of business speak or jargon. This is my personal favorite. I used to work in finance, and you hear so much jargon. And I quite enjoy hearing it, but I hate it. I hate jargon. I'm all about clear talking. One example here is our blue sky thinking this year is to try to obtain synergies. And it does actually, when you actually break it down, it does actually mean something. But often people don't know what those mean. So you might not have heard the term blue sky thinking before. I mean, I've heard it before. I think I know what it means. And this word synergy is often used a lot, which a lot of people don't understand what it means, but they'll use it because they have an idea of it. But clearly it limits communication. So location can be an issue. So like I said, with emails can cause miscommunication because you can't always ask follow-up questions. And preference for some sort of communication. So from personal experience, I know some managers really like one form of communication. So maybe some people like emails, some people like meetings. I've worked in businesses before in the past where the manager really likes meetings like every day. And I'm like, whereas for me, when people are talking at me, my brain kind of turns off fairly quickly. So I like emails because then I can read it in my own time and I can again go back later and check it. But I do like meetings as well, but there was an over-reliance. And also assumptions, assuming the other person is understood. And I think this comes back to culture as well. Where, I think in some cultures, if people don't understand it, they won't say they don't understand. Whereas in other cultures, they actually will. So, and I think this can be a personal thing as well. So some people might not, they just go, oh yeah, I get it, but they actually don't. And then, there's miscommunication that way. Right, that is communication done. I hope I've communicated the information effectively. It's a very short chapter and I've waffled to 8 minutes, but I hope it was useful. I'll see you next time.